Okay, hi everybody. I just wanted to read this book to you. It's Two Bad Ants by Chris Van Allsburg. It's one of my favorite books. I've had it forever, you can tell, because the outside of the book is kind of lost its color. So it sits on my shelf, and I do read it every year to my third graders. You might know Chris Van Allsburg. He's the one that wrote Jumanji and then Polar Express. So he's known for good writing. The news traveled swiftly through the tunnels of the ant world. A scout had returned with a remarkable discovery, a beautiful sparkling crystal. When the scout presented the crystal to the ant queen, she took one small bite, then quickly ate the entire thing. She deemed it the most delicious food she had ever tasted. Nothing could make her happier than to have more, much more. The ants understood. They were eager to gather more crystals because the queen was the mother of them all. Her happiness made the whole ant nest a happy place. It was late in the day when they departed. Long shadows stretched over the entrance of the ant kingdom. One by one, the insects climbed out, following the scout, who had made it clear there were many crystals where the first one had been found. But the journey was long and dangerous. They marched into the woods and surrounded their underground home. Dusk turned to twilight, twilight to night, and the path that followed twisted and turned around every bend, leading them deeper into the dark forest. As you can see, they think it's a forest, but it's really just grass. More than once, the line of ants stopped and anxiously listened for sounds of hungry spiders. But all they heard was a call of crickets echoing through the woods like distant thunder. Dew formed on the leaves above. Without warning, huge cold drops fell on the marching ants. A firefly passed overhead that, for an instant, lit up the woods with blinding flash of blue-green light. At the edge of the forest stood a mountain. The ants looked up and could not see its peak. It seemed to reach right to the heavens, but it did not stop. Up the side they climbed, higher and higher. So here's the mountain. The wind whistled through the cracks of the mountain face. The ants could feel its force bending their delicate antennae. Their legs grew weak as they struggled forward. At last they reached a ledge and crawled through a narrow tunnel. There's the narrow tunnel. When the ants came up out of the tunnel, they found themselves in a strange world. Smells they had known all their lives, smells of dirt and grass and rotting plants, had vanished. There was no more wind, and the most puzzling of all, it seemed like the sky was gone. They crossed smooth, shiny surfaces. They followed the scout up a glassy, curved wall. They had reached their goal. From the top of the wall, they looked below to the sea of crystals. One by one, the ants climbed down into the sparkling crystal. So here's the crystals. Can you figure out what they're climbing into? Quickly, they each chose a crystal, then turned and started their journey home. There was something about this unusual place that made the ants nervous. In fact, they left in such a hurry that none of them noticed that two small ants had stayed behind. "Why go back?" one asked the other. "This place may not feel like home, but look at these crystals." "You're right," said the other. "We could stay here and eat these tasty treasures every day forever." So the two ants ate crystal after crystal until they were too full to move, and they fell asleep. Daylight came. The sleeping ants were unaware of change taking place in their newfound home. A giant silver scoop hovered above them, then plunged deep into the crystals. It shoveled them both the ants and the crystals, and carried them high into the air. The ants were wide awake when the scoop turned and dropped them from a frightening height. They tumbled through the space in the shower of crystals and fell into a boiling brown lake. Here's the lake. Then the giant scoop swirled violently, back and forth. Crushing waves fell over the ants. They paddled hard to keep their tiny heads above the water, but the scoop kept spinning the hot brown liquid. Around and around it went, creating a whirlpool that sucked the ants deeper and deeper. They both held their breath and finally bobbed to the surface, gasping for air and spitting out mouthfuls of terrible, bitter water. Then the lake tilted and began to empty into a cave. The ants could hear the rushing water, and they felt themselves being pulled into the pitch black hole. Suddenly, the cave disappeared and the lake became calm. The ants swam to the shore and found that the lake had steep sides. They hurried down the wall that held back the lake. The frightened insects looked for a place to hide, worried that the giant scoop might shovel them up again. Close by found a huge round disc with holes, and they could hide neatly in them. But as soon as they climbed inside, their hiding place was lifted, tilted, and lowered into a dark place. When the ants climbed out of their holes, they were surrounded by a strange red glow. It seemed to them that every second the temperature was rising. Where do you think they are? As soon as it became so unbearable, it was so hot, they thought that they would just be cooked. But suddenly the disc that they were standing on rocketed upward, and the two hot ants flew out into the air. They landed near what seemed to be a fountain, a waterfall pouring from a silver tube. Both the ants had a powerful thirst and longed to dip their feverish heads into the refreshing water. They quickly climbed along the tube. As soon as they got close to the rushing water, the ants felt the cool spray. They tightly gripped the shining surface on the fountain and slowly leaned their head into the falling stream. But the force of the water was much too strong. The tiny insects were pulled off the fountain and plunged down into a wet, dark chamber. They landed on half-eaten fruit and other soggy things. Suddenly, the air was filled with loud, frightening sounds. The chamber began to spin. The ants were caught in a whirling storm of shredded food and stinging rain. Then, just as quickly as it started, the noise and the spinning stopped. Bruised and dizzy, the ants climbed out of the chamber. So they were in a garbage disposal. Oh my gosh, these poor ants. In daylight, once again, they raced through puddles and up a smooth metal wall. In the distance, they saw something comforting. Two long, narrow holes that reminded them of the warmth and safety of their old underground home. They climbed into the dark openings. But there was no safety inside. A strange force passed through the wet ants. They were stunned senseless and blown out of the holes like bullets from a gun. When they landed, the tiny insects were too exhausted to go on. They crawled into a dark corner and fell asleep. Night had returned when the battered ants woke to a familiar sound, the footsteps of their fellow insects. Returning for more crystals, the two ants slipped quietly at the end of the line. They climbed the glassy wall and once again stood amid their treasure. But this time they chose a single crystal and followed their friends home. Standing at the edge of the ant hole, the two ants listened to the joyful sounds that came from below. They knew how grateful their mother queen would be when they gave them her crystals. At the moment, the two ants felt happier than they'd felt before. This was their home, this was their family, and this is where they were meant to be. Thanks for watching.